If you're like me, you like salmon, not just because it tastes good, but it's also a great source of protein and omega 3 fish oil, which is good for the heart. A lot of salmon comes from the coastal waters of Alaska, especially Bristol Bay. Lately, some folks have claimed that climate change threatens Alaska's salmon population, and others warn that a proposed gold and copper mine there also threatens that great source of fish. Today, marine biologist Dr. David Shormann joins us to discuss these and related topics on From the Stacks. Stick around, you'll learn a lot, and if you'll post questions in the comments field, we'll do our best to answer for you as we go along. Hi, I'm Megan Kennard, Director of Communications and Operations for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation.
And I'm Cal Beisner. I'm the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance. Thanks much for joining us today on From the Stacks. As Megan said, we're going to be talking about salmon, fish, and wonderful food, and about climate change and how that affects them, and also about an interesting mining situation. So Megan, get us going, will you?
Salmon is among the most popular seafood dishes. Americans love it, and lots of it comes from Alaska. But lately, questions have arisen about the sustainability of our salmon fisheries there.
Yes, exactly. Some people think climate change threatens the salmon in Alaska's coastal waters. Others think a proposed gold, copper, and molybdenum mine, the Pebble Mine that a Canadian company wants to operate, would contaminate the waters of Bristol Bay, one of the premier salmon fisheries with toxic runoff. This evening, marine biologist Dr. David Shormann will help us evaluate these claims and give us a broader understanding of the situation. The closest I've ever come to fishing for salmon in Alaska was, frankly, fishing for cutthroat trout in Lake Powell in northern British Columbia, and then for steelhead in the Russian River of northern California, way back in my teens. But David has had a little more close-up experience with salmon fishing in Alaska. David, welcome to the show. Tell us about some of your experiences there.
Well, thank you, Megan and Cal, for having me on. I appreciate it and enjoy talking about these kinds of things. And I saw a quote recently from the famous wildlife ecologist Aldo Leopold. He said, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. And I think I would definitely be in the group who cannot live without wild things. And I've been to Alaska multiple times. First time was to conduct research on the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea back in the early 90s. And I've been there to lead father-son rafting, kind of science adventure trips, and also for vacation. And just from my experiences in Alaska, I've found, there's places you could just literally camp there all summer long and eat off the land. And I mean, if you like salmon and berries, then I mean, you could just be there for a very long time. I could eat that all day long, every day. But
Helps if you're a polar bear.
enjoyed being outside from a young age, especially around water. And that's just, I've always been drawn to those kinds of things.
Well, David, we'd like our viewers to know a bit more about you. Tell us about yourself. What's your background in education? How did you get interested in marine biology? And what do you do now?
Okay, Megan. Well, I've got an undergraduate, kind of have a weird background, pretty diverse undergraduate in aerospace engineering. And then after that, the defense industry crashed early 90s, and God opened a door for me to go to graduate school in marine chemistry, and then a PhD in wildlife and fisheries at Texas A&M with an emphasis on aquatic ecology. And during my master's, I made 2 trips to Alaska to study the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. And then after my PhD, God opened a door for my wife and I to teach math and science to home educated students. And so my engineering and science background were a good combination for us to start that family business. And that business called diveintomath.com now, digital interactive video education, and we produce math and science educational software taught from a biblical foundation with a focus on building a student's relationship with Christ. And in the summers, not anymore, but we used to do this. We may do it later, but we did science adventure camps in Alaska, in Texas, along the Texas coast. In Alaska, we did week-long float trips on rivers there, and some of those rivers were in the Bristol Bay Watershed, where
Hmm.
half the world's sockeye salmon return every year to spawn. Just a massive fishery there. And currently, I live in Hawaii, and we continue to run our educational software company here in Hawaii. And I also teach live online math classes to students all over the world. And you can learn more about those things at our website, diveintomath.com. And yeah, that's a little bit of what I do.
Awesome. Thank you. I was actually looking at your website today. I have a 3-month old and I'm
Oh,
already stressing over math. We
oh
plan on
gosh, okay.
homeschooling.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, so David, that's
Pre-
diveintomath.com. Is that right?
That that's
Diveintomath.com?
correct. Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
Diveintomath.com.
Great. I hope lots of our listeners will go there and with the pandemic and the shutdowns and whatnot, and many schools having closed in the spring, and some of them not likely to be opening in the fall, there may be a whole lot more demand for your service, and I think that's wonderful. In part
Yes,
because
we're busy right
who
now.
knows, it might,
That and
yeah,
yes, to say the least.
yeah, might
That's
even
great.
lead to some non-Christians going there and hearing the gospel for the first time. That would be just wonderful.
That would,
Well,
for sure. Yes.
David, a heat wave in the summer of 2019 resulted in a number of salmon die-offs in Alaskan streams. Would you tell us about these? Were they due to temporary, natural, local weather events or patterns, or should they be blamed on long-term man-made global warming?
Well, I would say, the climate is warming right now. There's evidence for that in Alaska. Elsewhere, before I moved to Hawaii, we lived in Texas, and I did lots of research there, lots of fishing there, and we used to have winter kills along the Texas coast, and those freeze millions of fish. And that would happen about every 10 to 15 years, but there hasn't been a major kill since 1989, so over 30 years now. What happened in 2019 in Alaska, though, I think that was a weather event. A massive high pressure system right around summer solstice. Just think about Alaska. Northern latitude days are super long up there around summer solstice. Some places in Alaska, the sun doesn't set. And that pressure system, that high pressure system, we even felt that in Hawaii all the way over here. It just spread across North Pacific. And something to think about with warmer water, it holds less oxygen. And being
Hmm.
cold-blooded, a salmon's metabolism would go up, so their demand for oxygen would be more. And so if you've seen any images of salmon going up a stream, especially in the Bristol Bay area, you know that they can just be absolutely loaded with fish. And so you have warm water and less oxygen and a massive amount of fish, and all of a sudden the temperature goes up, they're kind of stuck there, and they can die.
Hmm.
And fish kills did result from that. Um, but on the plus side of that, they still had a massive run of salmon, especially in Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay set a record for the value of their 2019 salmon harvest. So
Hmm.
basically, they had both high numbers and a high price per pound. And outside Bristol Bay, a place that I've been fishing many times, the Kenai River and that watershed, that it's a popular river for sport fishermen. That saw almost 2 million sockeye salmon return. That's about twice as many as last year, and it's also about twice as many as this year as well. So,
Hmm.
fish kills from hot weather, those did impact salmon streams for sure in Alaska last year, but that was a weather event. I think that's the best way to understand that, not a
Hmm.
because of catastrophic climate change or anything like that.
Yeah. So what part of what you're saying is that there is global warming going on, but whether it's man-made or natural is an entirely different question. And in either case, it doesn't seem to be that has driven those salmon die-offs. Rather, it was
Right,
short-term, localized weather events.
right, right. And I I haven't studied this in detail, but as far as I know, that didn't happen again this year,
Okay.
which is, confirms more,
So,
that that was a weather event.
so even though that specifically was a weather event, some people think that a warming climate will be big trouble for salmon. Is it? And are there any benefits to salmon from warming?
Well, I think it would take a massive amount of warming to cause big trouble. And a couple of examples. Cal mentioned the Russian River. There's more than one Russian River. Actually, there's a Russian River in Alaska. It's a tributary of the Kenai River. And the fish count data, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and hopefully we'll have that website. It's a good place to study fisheries data, and they have a fish count link on there, and they've been
Hmm.
collecting data on the Russian River since 1960. So 60 years of data, and if you look at that fish count website, it appears the peak sockeye numbers now in 20, those come in about a week or so later in the summer than they did in the 60s. And so, in other words, they can handle gradual warming. They just kind of shift around that. It's when they arrive and then they have a problematic weather event that drives the temperature up, which reduces the oxygen, and then they're basically stuck there. That can be a problem. So another example is that in some locations, a warming climate that can provide more optimal temperatures for growth. And salmon and most fish, they are creatures of optimal ranges, and so this is too cold, this is too hot. There's an optimum range, and I mean, think about we're talking about Alaska. It's like so cold time there, over half the year, and it's so cold that the tree line, like in the Bristol Bay region, is at 1,500-foot elevation. Compare that to about 10,000 foot in Colorado. So if you
Hmm.
get some climate gradual warming, it's going to open up more territory for salmon. And I think that's exactly what's happening in the Bristol Bay region.
Hmm. Hmm. So, in part, it sounds to me like uh, the reason that global climate change or global warming is not likely to be a problem, but could actually be beneficial to salmon, is that global average temperature is not expected to rise more than just perhaps a degree and a half, 2 degrees, maybe 2.5 degrees. Whereas the kind of temperature change that's necessary to cause a die off is the kind of thing that you get in a very remarkable heat wave where the temperature change is more in the range of excuse me, more in the range of 15, 20 degrees above normal. um, and that's in the atmosphere, while the temperature that's relevant to the salmon is in the water. And the same amount of energy that raises atmospheric temperature by, say, 20 degrees would only raise water temperature by a fraction of a degree because water is so much more dense than air. So, anyway, thanks for your insights on that. We're going to take just a
Yes.
quick little commercial break. In a minute, we'll go back to dive more deeply into the Alaskan salmon situation. But right now, though, we want to tell our listeners how they can get a great book absolutely free. In Klexit for a Brighter Future, the case for withdrawing from United Nations climate treaties, energy engineer Don Deers explains why it's not that President Donald Trump is withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, a withdrawal that becomes effective the day after America's presidential election in November, and that would survive if President Trump is reelected, but that Joe Biden would surely reverse if he's elected. When you read Klexit, you'll understand and you'll be able to tell your elected officials in Congress and the White House exactly why the United States should withdraw not just from the Paris Climate Agreement, but also from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which created the organization under which the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and ensuing climate agreements have functioned. Just as the people of Britain voted to Brexit, leaving the European Union and the laws imposed by it without the consent of those affected, Americans should Clexit, leaving the Framework Convention on Climate Change. From now through the end of August, as our way of saying thank you for a donation of literally any size, we'll send you a free copy of Clexit, and your donation will be 100% tax deductible. All you have to do is to go to the link shown on your screen, make your donation, and in the comments field, ask for Clexit and mention promo code 2008. That's promo code 2008. That's for 2020 and August the 8th month. And your donation will help the Cornwall Alliance continue its work of educating the public and policymakers about biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the Christian faith centered on the great news that sinners like me can be reconciled to the Holy God by grace alone, through faith alone, in the fully sufficient atoning death and triumphant resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, David, the Bristol Bay region, Alaska, is home to one of the world's greatest salmon fisheries. In fact, over 10% of the world's harvest and 50% of the sockeye harvest comes from there. In spite of incredible fishing pressure and a warming climate, the area has actually seen record numbers of sockeye in recent years. Why is that?
Well, I think just studying this some and from what other scientists have studied, reading that the warming climate is providing more optimal conditions for growth for young salmon. And we mentioned just how cold Alaska is, and that if you make it a little bit warmer, and in some places, and it just happens that this is happening in the Bristol Bay watershed, it's providing some more optimal growth temperatures there. And think about sockeye. There's 5 species of Pacific salmon, 6 if you go over to the other side to Russia. There's a 6th species over there, but 5 in Alaska, and they have different life cycles. Sockeye, they can spend up to 2 years in lakes and streams before heading out to sea. And so slight warming of lakes that are too cold anyway, below optimum. So slight warming in that Bristol Bay watershed, that's resulted in more optimal growth conditions. And that warming climate in the Bristol Bay, that's been a big plus for salmon, and they just seem to be thriving there right now, and for several years now.
Yeah. So there's actual documented evidence of increased salmon populations in Bristol Bay itself?
Yes, for sure. And again, a good source for viewers is the Alaska Department of Fish and Game website, and you go to their link on fish counts, and you can study that fish count data. And there's several rivers that flow into Bristol Bay. One that they keep track of, I believe since 1980 is what I saw. They've kept track of the New Shagic River, and that's a major tributary of Bristol Bay. And salmon in most fish that range of optimum conditions, optimum temperatures, but also optimum spawning habitat, optimum oxygen levels, optimum numbers of spawning salmon. You can have too many. You can have not enough, but you can also have too many. So the last several years, they've seen massive numbers of salmon returning, really too many to catch in some cases. And they just flood in so fast that it'll sink the fishermen's nets. There's so many salmon in their nets, and all the commercial, recreational, subsistence fishermen just can't catch them all. And
That reminds me of
it's
a
a good
passage in the
problem to
Bible.
have. Yeah, it's a good problem to have, and so really, the fisheries scientists, they have ranges of, we need this many salmon coming into this river, and there's a minimum and a maximum. And so obviously they want it somewhere in that range between minimum and maximum levels. Too many, again, that can uh, cause too much competition. The salmon come downstream too small, and
Mm.
they don't survive as well. But anyways, so they may have to adjust their minimum and maximum numbers because of the warming habitat. As the
Mm.
climate warms, they may need to do some adjustments to that, and allow more fish to be caught and things like that.
Okay.
Well, here at the Alliance, we talk a lot about human flourishing. How does salmon contribute to human flourishing in that region?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I think there's some, obviously there's always room for improvement, but right now the way they have the Bristol Bay Fishery is a permitting system, and I believe that was started in the 1970s. And so they have thousands of permits, and there's certain size of boat, certain size of net that you can use, and what that's ended up doing is creating lots of small businesses and just,
Mm.
family. And then they have some friends come along and they go fishing in their boat, and 6, 7 people in a boat, and bring in the fish. And so in the summer, there's 14,000 people working there, in commercial fishing, but also sport fishing. Lots of sport fishing there, and ecotourism, because the salmon attract the bears, and the bears are doing great in the Bristol Bay watershed, and people want to go watch them chasing the salmon and catching the salmon. There's fish processing, there's transportation, there's lots of things going on there, lots of jobs being provided, and a lot of just, small businesses going on there.
Mm.
They have excellent sport and commercial regulations to protect the salmon harvest, and so that helps promote all of this. They have restrictions on the type of gear that you can use, and the boat size. So that allows, for several thousand small businesses, as opposed to, let's say, a handful of factory trawlers.
Mm.
And I think, the trend has been for more out of state and fewer local permits.
Mm.
There's different reasons for that. People that were there, they're moving away because they see better quality of life somewhere that's maybe not so cold half the year. That has been part of that, but some people would prefer, more local help with fishing, and make it easier for locals. Um, Indigenous groups, many of them benefit from salmon. That's a substantial part of their diet. They go from
Mm.
salmon fishing to berry picking to moose and reindeer hunting, and that's a big part of their life. And again, other businesses, ecotourism and bear viewing. I've read that this is basically a $1.5 billion annual industry with all these
Mm.
small businesses. So I think there is just a lot there with that salmon fishery to help the individual and the family.
Mm. Okay. Well, David, how sensitive are salmon to various different environmental stresses? We've been talking mostly about temperature here, but what about other stresses like sediments in the water, like
Hmm.
pollutants getting into it, and so on? Are salmon highly sensitive to this? What do you think on that?
Well, from what I know of salmon, they're pretty resilient. If they can go out 3,000-mile round trip and come back and find the stream that they were born in, go up all these waterfalls, past bears, past fishermen, and everything, they're
Hmm.
incredible creations, and they can handle a lot. They have to switch from being born in fresh salt water, and then they have to switch back. They're anadromous, and so God's designed them to be able to switch osmoregulatory mechanisms, basically. So,
Can you
yeah,
define those terms for our viewers?
osmoregulation means they have to switch from, taking in, handling salt on the outside, to handling
Okay.
fresh water, and yeah, it's a very complex cellular process that their bodies basically have to switch on and off, to be able to
And
adjust to those
anadromous.
extremes in their outside environment of,
Yeah.
the water. So And again, they can adjust to temperature extremes by spawning earlier or later in the year.
Hmm.
And we talked about that quite a bit already. They can't handle large sediment load in a spawning area because that can
Hmm.
smother the eggs, clog the gills,
Ah.
things like that. Acidic
Uh-huh.
water, that's known to be detrimental to them. And metal contamination,
Okay.
copper, metal in particular, is detrimental. And so, if for whatever reason, you get acidic water, metals dissolve better in acidic water. So you can, if the water becomes more acidic for whatever reason, a volcano or mining or something else, and
Mm-hmm.
mining runoff, then that can dissolve more metals, which can be more detrimental. And then, of course, the one of the big sensitivities is oxygen. Absolutely demand oxygen-rich water, especially when there's lots of fish spawning in the same area.
Okay.
That's interesting. Well, Al Gore once said that the Earth would be a total frying pan by 2016. Doomsday scenarios like these have not played out, and the Bristol Bay salmon fishery is evidence of that. But what are some real threats to the Bristol Bay salmon fishery? I mean, you mentioned um, chemical or metals in the water. What are other ones?
Overfishing. So we did mention that I believe they have it very well regulated right now. They have that permit system, and just the way that's set up to promote the small businesses and just individuals, I think, are just going to be more concerned about the fishery than like a big factory trawler might be. But overfishing could end up being an issue at some point. Another thing is excessive hatchery fish for food supplies in the open ocean. So they get out in the open ocean and they're competing with fish from different hatcheries in different locations internationally, uh, Japan in particular, um, but also Washington, Oregon, and other parts of Alaska, Canada. So if you have too many fish out in the open ocean competing for a limited resource, that can cause trouble. They the Bristol Bay fishery, though, that it does tend to be a little bit more protected from all of that just because of its location on the more northern side of the Aleutian Islands, and those fish tend to go more out into the Bering Sea rather than the Pacific. But anyways, that that can be a problem other places. And too many fish spawning. We mentioned that. That can be a problem competing for limited resources in the lake or stream. And then, of course, water pollution, natural, like from a volcano. This is a very volcanic region here. The biggest volcanic eruption in over 100 years, Nova Erupta, that happened there in Katmai National Park nearby. And
Hmm.
that watershed drains into Bristol Bay. And so ashfall could smother eggs, rainfall, and heavy metals from natural seepage, things like that. And then mines can also produce all of those effects as well, just from the
Okay.
mining operation, uh, putting sediment, excess sediment in the water, acidic
Hmm.
water, seepage from the mine, and heavy metals that might go with that.
Okay. Well, let's pick up on that last point, David. Near Bristol Bay is an area of roughly 186 square miles, loosely called the Pebble Mine, that contains the world's largest undeveloped copper ore body. And it also has a lot of gold, molybdenum, and other metals. And the estimated combined value of all of these metals is over $300 billion. Now, you've spoken of salmon fishery in that area being about a $1.5 billion a year industry. It would take a good while for $300 billion to be stacked up in that. The New York Times recently reported that that mine, if it's fully approved finally and opens up, would employ nearly 1,000 people, and that the Canada based mining company Northern Dynasty Minerals would pay for infrastructure improvements, roads, bridges, water lines, electric lines, and so on. in some Alaskan native villages and pay cash dividends of at least $3 billion to people in the area. Now, and opponents have argued in the public and in the courts for well over a decade about whether the Pebble Mine should be developed. Opponents say the risk to fish stocks is unacceptable. Proponents say the risks are outweighed by the benefits that would come from all of the wealth generated by the mine. And last month, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers issued an environmental analysis saying that operation of the Pebble Mine would, this is a quoting, would not be expected to have a measurable effect on fish numbers in the Bristol Bay watershed. So, what's your thinking on the Pebble Mine? What impacts could the Pebble Mine have on the salmon's environment, and how justified are the concerns?
Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on the mine. I've been trying to do a lot of reading on it. I'm not an expert on salmon necessarily either, and I love salmon and salmon fishing and just the incredible watershed that's there in that Bristol Bay area. It's just amazing. But from the things that I've read, I think the Pebble Mine is the wrong mine. It's in the wrong place, and I think it's for the wrong reasons too. And you mentioned, it primarily holds copper, and just some things to think about here. That's a metal required in virtually all technology. It's an important
Mhm.
metal, but it's especially needed in what's called green technology and things like electric vehicles. And just one example, an electric car that requires 3 times more copper than a gas-powered car. And
Mhm.
so the irony, or you might say hypocrisy, is that Pebble plans to build a giant 270 megawatt gas fired power plant to power the mine. And just some perspective on that, that's enough power to power about 15% of the island of Oahu where I live. And so that's huge. It takes a lot of energy to run the mine of this size. It's a gigantic. And so think about this. They're going to use fossil fuels to mine the copper for Green New Deal technology. Um, water. Water use is 3 times the amount of the entire city of Anchorage. That's how much water they're going to use on an annual basis. They need that to create the slurry to get the metals out and to
Mm.
process the ore. So an incredible amount of water. They're going to get that from groundwater and surface water in the region. And again, it's important to understand that this mine is at the very top, the Bristol Bay watershed. It's not like halfway down or at the base or whatever. It's at the very top. And so I think a thing that's not understood very well is the salmon nursery areas, that habitat.
Mm.
Um, this watershed is just this labyrinth of little streams and groundwater. This was all glaciers here, but just think about those things grinding and pounding up rock, the glaciers, and then that all retreats, and so you just have this porous material for water to flow through. And one year there's a stream here, and then that goes away and opens up another stream somewhere else, and all of these little streamlets, these little tributaries off of the main rivers, those are nursery habitat for young salmon. And so think about if you start using the groundwater and the surface water. So you're going to have less of that, the water level is going to drop. And so you're going to decrease the habitat in ways I don't think they quite understand. Um, they're proposed to destroy over 100 miles of streams right now, that are just normally flowing streams. I think you see it in the image there, that Koktuli River, um, that 100 miles of the north and south fork of that, and raise water temperatures, because you think about if the water level goes down, it's going to heat it up more, and then it's going to also shut down a lot of those tributaries. Um,
Mm.
Another thing is that this is a sulfide mine. this area receives 36 inches of rain a year or so, quite a bit of rain. So rain plus sulfide ore, especially any waste ore, there's going to be a lot of waste in this tailing. So rain plus sulfide ores, that equals sulfuric acid. And so we mentioned this before, it's a copper mine, so lots of copper. They're not going to extract every bit of copper from all of those tailings. And so any of that, rain gets onto that, seeps into the ground. There's a large potential there for sulfuric acid, copper water, just all the, this like the worst case scenario for salmon at the very top of the stream in that nursery habitat. So, to me, you just don't put a massive mine at the top of a watershed for the world's best salmon fishery. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm not against mining, but it just doesn't seem like a good idea. And I still need to do more research. I encourage viewers to do your own research on this. And everything though I see that tells me the concerns about this mine in this place, for the reasons that would favor Green New Deal technology and things like that, and pushing that forward at a faster pace. I think all those concerns are very justified.
David, before we got ready for doing this program, I pretty much was convinced that the mine ought to go ahead. I'd done quite a lot of reading on it, and then in looking at some of the materials that you sent to us, and some of the emails back and forth that we had in preparation for this program, you've actually weakened my support for the mine, and perhaps I might be near ready to changing positions. That's one of the fun things that I get to do. That we have with the Cornwall Alliance, is that we have experts with a variety of different expertise who can bring new insights to us. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that I think you probably recognized in advance that I was fairly favorable to the Pebble Mine, yet you haven't held any punches, and that's great. It's good. Iron sharpens iron, although I don't gather that there's any iron in the Pebble Mine. It's all copper and gold and so. But anyway, I really appreciate the way you're going at it. And just as one quick side comment for our viewers to keep in mind, one of the things that I've found is very, very important in looking at all the different arguments pro and con on all kinds of different environmental issues is trying to gain a sense of proportion, a sense of perspective on things. A great illustration of this was an article that came out, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, called "What Happens If Mount Everest Gets Cast Sea?" And it was an article that was designed to scare people about rapid sea level rise. And it said, look, every year, the amount of ice that's melting from Greenland is equal to the dimensions of Mount Everest. And obviously that's huge, and it must cause vast sea level rise. But there was no effort by the writers of that article to provide perspective, to provide proportion. So I got the figures, I got the data, and it turned out that if you had all of Mount Everest into the sea, the difference that it would make in sea level would be immeasurably small. It would take thousands and thousands of years of casting Mount Everest into the sea to make even just a couple of inches difference in sea level. And so perspective, proportion is very important. And I'm not wanting to argue. You mentioned about possibly messing up about 100 miles of stream in that area. One of the sources that I read on this indicated that the total mileage of streams in that area is so large that even 100 miles would actually be fairly small in proportion. Nonetheless, if it's really key position, If it's in locations that are especially important to the spawning of the salmon, then a small amount can be a really serious problem. So I think it's an issue on which both you and I are going to try to continue to do some more study. One of these times we might be able to get back to this topic. There's another fellow who's a friend of mine, is Paul Dreesen, who's written sometimes for the Cornwall Alliance, and Paul has actually written on this topic in the past. We might be able to bring Paul and the two of us together on the program to continue discussion of this. We're always faced with trade-offs, and that's also something that I think is really important for people to keep in mind about environmental issues. You don't get something for nothing in anything. And or as some economists put it, they have an acronym TANSTAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch, right? And so, if we want to have a pebble mine, if we want to have a mine to bring out minerals to use to make engines and things like that, well, we're going to have some pollution from that mine. If
Yeah.
we want to avoid the pollution, then we may have to do without some of the engines and so on. We're always dealing with cost benefit analysis, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We've already discussed a bit the importance of pristine environments to the maintenance of salmon populations over time, and as you pointed out, the Pebble Mine would present some risk to that, and you've sketched a bit of what those would be. Would you want to expand on that at all, David, before we move on to some other issues?
Sure. Yeah, I recently read a book called Stronghold by Tucker Malarkey, and she basically highlights the life of her cousin, Guido Rahr. I believe he's the president of the Wild Salmon Center. I may have that wrong. But
Hmm.
with that Wild Salmon Center, Guido has traveled the world studying salmon, and basically that means like Pacific Northwest and Russia, because Russia has lots and lots of salmon as well. And everywhere that he found thriving wild salmon populations, there was a pristine ecosystem behind that.
Hmm.
And he also talks in that book some of, I touched on just the labyrinth of groundwater and small tributaries. He touched on that some and just the importance of that nursery habitat. Um, and so, yeah, that pristine ecosystem and thriving salmon, those things
Hmm.
do seem to go hand in hand.
We'll move outside of Alaska for just a minute. We'll come back to Alaska. But in the Pacific Northwest, California, Oregon, and Washington, salmon has struggled for decades. What factors have contributed to their struggle?
Well, I think some of the overfishing there, poor land management has been a problem there, particularly related to logging, and just the not that logging is bad in itself, but just the way it was done, and just the poor water quality that resulted from that,
Hmm.
and dams blocking, improperly designed that block salmon migration, and fish hatcheries. I mentioned that earlier too. Those also appear to be contributing to the problem in some places. You would think that, well, okay, we put a fish hatchery here and start producing X number of salmon, that then they're going to return and the wild population is going to increase. It's going to be great, but that's its own story itself. But that doesn't seem to be happening in a lot of places. And in fact, when the hatchery fish, a lot of times, one thing is that they can be genetically inferior, and so
Hmm.
they end up spawning with the wild population or whatever and bring everybody down basically.
Hmm.
So you end up diluting the
What
stock with
causes
genetically
what
inferior fishes.
what causes the genetic inferiority in the hatchery fish? I've never heard of that.
Well, I think,
Makes me curious.
yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I couldn't answer that well right now. um, but
That's a
I think some
refreshing
of that is
answer.
just
A lot of scientists
um,
are afraid to say that.
Yeah, well, that's yeah. I don't know is sometimes a very good thing because I mean it's super
Absolutely.
complicated and yeah I think just what people are understanding about wild salmon is that they are just genetically and I think epigenetically too what controls the genes. They have both of those things going on. And when you start looking in more detail at salmon, I touched on it a little bit how, the run timing of salmon, when do they come in? I mean, like on the Kenai River, for example, that actually has two different sockeye salmon runs. There's an early and a late run. Some of that is probably because of climate related things over time, but that early run is genetically different from the late run. The springers, they're called in some places, spring king salmon run, they're different from the late fall run. Um, and I mean, the rivers can just be a few miles apart and they can have big differences in their genetics. And so they just can't get that genetic diversity into a fish hatchery. Um, and so I guess over time, whatever happens, genetic and epigenetically, those fish just start to become become weaker. They're not fit for their environment when they're turned out. Um, yeah, there's a lot going on there that yeah, with that, it's a very interesting problem for sure.
Well, going back to Alaska, you had mentioned that a lot of the fishermen are local, it's families, it's small businesses. Are there large salmon fishing fleets? Is it solely a local economic benefit, or do some of these fisherwomen live elsewhere?
Now, most of them, the majority, live elsewhere. So I mentioned this before. I think the permit system that began in the 1970s, and it was mostly local then. But many of them have moved out of state for many reasons, and so that does transfer the wealth out of state. And one reason they move out of state, just better opportunities for raising families in the lower 48. Bristol Bay, it's a cold and desolate place half the year or more. It's small and isolated as it is anyway, so many move away if they can afford to. And another reason that there's fewer local fishermen is that there was a fisheries crash in the 90s, and so to make some money, many people sold their permits to non-Alaskans, and so of those non-residents that are there now, and there's graphs that you can see. People have done research on that. You can just watch the trend of resident versus non-resident since the 70s, and the non-resident goes up and the resident permits go down. But so there's a couple of reasons there that people that the locally there's not as many people fishing now, but still provides thousands and thousands of jobs.
Okay, so David, some of the opponents of the Pebble Mine say that the proponents of it, those who support it, want to put at risk thousands of small business operators, the owners and employees of the fishing fleets, and their $1.5 billion annual revenue from salmon related jobs. Do you find yourself fairly sympathetic to that argument, or or not?
Well, I think that permit system, it's not perfect. I think it was a great idea that they did that, and it essentially created thousands of small businesses. I think that's something that's needed. That type of type of mentality. I mean, the fishery. I think because there's just so many people that want that resource, and they see the money that's there too. It has to be regulated, and I think that permitting system is a good way to do that. And I just think small businesses and the individuals that are running that, they're going to connect more people to the resource that way. And they're just there's just that relationship that goes with that. And I don't know. I mean, I can imagine instead of that system, if they had large factory trawlers that were allowed to fish, I mean, it would just be a handful of boats controlling everything. Most of that wealth would probably go elsewhere. It would be fewer people. So, I just think that the way they have it set up right now, I just think it's just a very American way to do this, I think, with, they have the permits. The
Yeah.
permits are on a free market. You can go sell your permit for X number of dollars. They're selling for six figures now, in some
Wow.
cases. And so, yeah, they're uh, pretty pricey now, but that that has allowed small businesses to thrive.
Hmm. Well, one more point about the Pebble mine, and then we'll move on from there. Obviously, the world needs a whole lot of copper, gold, and other minerals, and whatever doesn't come from the Pebble mine will have to come from mines in other places around the world. But the United States has far tighter pollution control regulations than most other nations, especially those in developing countries. Not to mention the actual, or at least near actual, slave labor that gets employed in countries like China and the Republic of Congo, which are now major sources for a lot of the metallic minerals, and in both of which child slave labor is pretty common. So it seems that in terms of both human rights and environmental protection, getting those minerals from a mine in Alaska might be preferable on a global basis to getting them from one in most other countries. Nonetheless, a lot of folks are still concerned that the Pebble Mine would be problematic specifically because of the type of mine that it would be. It would be an open mine. And in some of our discussion prior to the program, you raised an interesting question as to uh, how that measures up in terms of creation stewardship compared with other mining options. Would you just expand on that for us in terms of our Christian understanding of the stewardship of creation and that type of mining?
Right. Well, I didn't get to research this as much as I wanted to, and it's uh, I think one of the main things is, we need to focus more on extracting our own resources, um, and also exposing horrific practices where those are, and working for change. Um, I mean, it's one thing to have mining in another country, but it's a totally different thing to have mining in another country and the employees are slaves or 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
Um, so that that wouldn't happen in America. Um, but when you have a mine here, it just needs to be done the right way. And honestly, I don't know what a better system would be for having a mine. It just seems like something smaller, or just something that is in a different location. The
Hmm.
proposed Pebble Mine, I mean, it it's it's massive compared to, if you compare it to all of the other mines in Alaska, in the history of Alaska.
Hmm.
It's just totally dwarfs everything, and so there's just a big unknown. Yes, you can make a environmental impact statement about that, but it's kind of it's there's just so much unknown still with that. And I think, yeah, go get copper, go get gold, go get molybdenum, but I think for right now anyways, that needs to be done somewhere else, because there's nothing to compare this to. Well, if there's no other place where they built a mine at the top of world famous fishery that provides food for lots and lots of people, there's just no
Hmm.
other comparison for that. And how did that play out? Um, so Yeah, it's
That pie graph, that pie graph that you provided for us is really quite impressive. I mean, I talked
it's
about the need for seeing proportion, and that really that really does show us
yeah,
proportion, doesn't it? And
right,
I guess
right,
the saying is "look before you leap." I suppose the higher the cliff from which you're going to leap, the more closely you better look. And
yeah,
this is a great indicator of just how huge this is, and therefore how
right,
carefully we really should be measuring all of the risks, all of the potential benefits involved here before
right.
a final decision is made. Uh,
Yes,
David,
yes, for sure.
thank you. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. As we close, please tell us two things. First, what insights does the biblical worldview offer about living with risks like these? And second, how can our listeners learn more about Dive, your educational platform, Dive into Math?
Well, thanks again for having me, Cal and Megan. And just going in reverse there, I'll answer the second question first. Just the best way to learn about us is diveintomath.com, or a friend who's homeschooled for a while. They may have used our math and science software at some point. So it's always good to have that word of mouth and have some testimony from somebody else. So both of those, our website and a friend who homeschools, those are good ways to find out about us and what we don't. Don't take my word for it, somebody else's. And then Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 28 talks about ruling over creation, and I think that's one of the first things God told us to do. Manage. I made this for you, manage it. And so we want to manage it well. That is something that
Mhm.
I talk about in my math and science classes. You might wonder why that's in a math class, but math is considered the language of science. We use it all the time in science. And so both of those places, I try to talk about that. And so we want to be able to use it. So we look at copper ore, and we're like, oh wow. I mean, that just amazes me that, I mean, who figured that out, that you could take this metal and like pound it up and heat it and do these different things, and then you get copper metal out of it. I mean, that's just fascinating to me that God gave us that ability to do that. But with that comes waste, and what do we do? Is this a great idea? Okay, so we can get copper here, but then we have to build a 700-foot tall dam in an earthquake and volcanic prone area at the top of the
Hmm.
world's best salmon fishery. Um, and then we have to keep that intact um, and manage that forever. Um, so is that the best use of what God has given us?
Hmm.
Or should we just slow down and maybe look at another way that we could extract resources from here that would not just have this potential, this incredible potential to damage the world's best salmon fishery? So,
Hmm.
we want to be good stewards of the salmon, right? But we
Yeah.
also want to use God's creation and other resources that He's given us too. So, so it's a good thing to pray about, to reason through more, and yeah, it's a lot going on there with that. A lot to benefit, but a lot to harm as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shormann. We look forward to having you on the program again. Friends, let me remind you that from now to the end of August, you can receive a free copy of Don Deere's great book, Klexit for a Brighter Future, The Case for Withdrawing from the United Nations Climate Treaties, which will help you explain to your friends and your elected representatives why the United States should withdraw from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. To get your free copy of Klexit, I am going to put a link in the comments in just a second. And you can click on that, make a 100% tax deductible donation of any size, ask for Klexit, mention promo code 20-08, and we will send that to you as our thank you gift. Thanks for watching. Join us again next week at 7 p.m. Eastern for From the Stacks.